I had no idea that one day I would be standing up here welcoming almost 8,000 people to our very first Blizzcon. We just wanted to make some great games. All of you have put your lives on hold for the next 2 days to join us in this celebration of Blizzard games and to celebrate the communities that have grown around them. We would not be here today doing what we do without your support. And that's really what BlizzCon is all about. This is an opportunity for you to meet our developers and speak with them, to learn a little bit about how they perform their craft and about how Blizzard goes about making games. Make sure you check that out. We also have 2 very big announcements to make. The first is related to StarCraft Ghost. We have added playable Zerg. That's right. And you will be the very first people outside of Blizzard's offices to play as a Zergling, Hydralisk, Mutalisk, or Infested Marine. That's right. In StarCraft Ghost multiplayer games, up to 16-player multiplayer. And our second announcement, well, how many of you have played World of Warcraft? In a very short time, we will be announcing details about the upcoming World of Warcraft expansion, the Burning Crusade. We have lots of other cool stuff as well. There's an art gallery with artwork from our games as well as some amazing fan art. There will be a mixer tonight with the development teams, and you will be able to enter some of the contests, like Gary was mentioning. Of course, there's the costume contest. Jonathan Davis from Korn is here. And he will be judging the song contest tonight. And tomorrow night, we have a great night of entertainment planned. In their first live performance ever outside of Kalimdor, Level 60 Elite Tauren Chieftain is here. Trust me, you don't want to miss that. Comedian Christian Finnegan is here. And our headliner, we're very excited to have The Offspring. I hope you all have a great time. It's really an honor to welcome you all here to our home in Southern California. We look forward to talking with some of you and meeting you over the next 2 days. Thank you again for coming, and welcome to BlizzCon.
Thank you all, thank you. Why is World of Warcraft so successful? I mean, there's many reasons, as you can tell. All right, yeah. There is one reason that comes to my mind. It's community. The fantastic community we have, players like all of you. And, you know, it's on a daily basis where we read your stories, watch your videos. I mean, we can't get through a day without it. So on behalf of everyone at Blizzard and the Warcraft team, World of Warcraft team, I salute you. Actually, I should say /salute you. But we are especially excited to be here today, as Mike mentioned, to unveil for you our first World of Warcraft expansion, the Burning Crusade. You will get to play 2 new races, the first of which we're debuting today, the Blood Elves of Quel'Thalas. Players will get to adventure into the shattered world of Outland and explore through the Dark Portal. Exciting new dungeons, to name a few: Medivh's Tower of Karazhan, broken and shattered by vile magics. Now, this is an exciting one: Caverns of Time, where players will get to go back into the past and actually participate in famous Warcraft moments. Illidan. How many of you know Illidan? Do we got any Illadins out there, actually? I don't know. Yeah, right there, yeah. You get to go to the Black Temple, which he calls his home, and kick his ass. Yeah. Players will get to purchase flying mounts, epic flying mounts in Outland. These mounts will allow you to explore areas of Outland that are otherwise unreachable. New profession of jewel crafting. The idea of socketed items where you can now do more customization to weapons and armor. Blood elves, what do you think, huh? Guess that means more guys playing girls, yeah? Okay, but seriously, we have an exciting show ahead for you today and tomorrow. So I encourage all of you, you'll learn more about the Burning Crusade and other Blizzard games at the fantastic developer panels we have going on. I encourage you all to take a part of those. We also have hundreds of computers out here as you walked in on the show floor. You can take a first-hand peek at the Blood Elves and their starting area. Right now, after this is done here, I encourage all of you to go out, get some lunch, check out the show floor, but most importantly, replenish your health, restore your mana, relax. Welcome to Blizzcon.
So we'll start off with the definition of a raid, because it's PowerPoint and we gotta be corporate and no, I'm just kidding. The dictionary defines a raid as an entrance into another's territory for the purpose of seizing goods or valuables. So we know exactly why you guys are raiding. Don't think for a second that we're ignorant to that. For today's discussion, when we talk about raiding, we're talking about large groups encountering tough NPCs at the end game. So let's talk about end game content and why that is important. We don't have experience loss in World of Warcraft, and heat only rises. All of our player characters, anybody who buys World of Warcraft and starts playing, they're only going to level up. We also have to give players something to aspire to. There's a lot to be said for that moment when you're sitting in Orgrimmar as a newbie and somebody runs through in like all raid gear and you're like, wow, that guy must be so powerful. Or eBay or something. Anyway, the world feels a lot bigger for everyone if there's unbeaten content out there. Even if you're the guy who's like level 30 doing a Arathi Highlands quest, but you know that the resident Uber guild of your servers, trying to kill Nefarian, it creates an epic feel for the whole world. How come there aren't any low-level raids? If you ever want to raid something at low level, you could just try something that's higher level, but there's no real point to us creating this raid content that's going to be trivialized by levels anyway. I'll never raid. Why should I care about raid content in World of Warcraft? Well, we hear this all the time, and then people end up contradicting themselves. They actually end up raiding. So a lot of people say, I'll never, that's not something that I'll ever do, and then they'll get into that like one Zul'Gurub raid and go, that was so much fun, I got this awesome item, it's actually something I want to do. I told everybody yesterday about my mom. She had never played a video game before, and then I got her into our friends and family alpha thinking she'd load it up and go, oh, the graphics are pretty, is that what you do? But she actually started playing the game and she got pretty good at it, and now she has 2 level 60s and a level 50 that she's like on the way up with that one. And she plays Horde, by the way, so she's... So my whole point is that people who said that they would never engage in this sort of thing might one day find themselves doing it. She gets invited to Molten Core raids all the time. So there's what I like to call the 1% myth. Why do you create content for 1% of your population? 1% is such a convenient number, just pulled out of thin air. Our server programmers, Joe Rumsey and Brian Gibson-Winge, provided me with some statistics. They're able to log everything. So every night at prime time in the US, there are 500 Molten Cores with 15,000 players, 150 Onyxias with 2,500 players, 250 Blackwing Lairs, that's 6,000 players, and 700 Zul'Gurub instances with 10,000 players. But I like to point out that most raiding guilds do Onyxia once a week, and they do Molten Core one night a week. So this is different groups that you're seeing. On a lot of servers, we will see 500 to 700 people in Molten Core at prime time every night of the week. So there's a ton of people. On the weekend, like right now, there's going to be 35,000 people in Molten Core and Zul'Gurub. So 800 of those Molten Cores and 700 Zul'Gurubs. The night Zul'Gurub went live, I think we had 2,300 instances of it running just during prime time. That's like a 2-hour window. So Onyxia was the first raid encounter that we implemented. I took a picture of her on her birthday right there. That's right after she got placed. It's a placeholder model. We didn't have the final model for Onyxia at the time. So it's, I think, August 12th at 11:30 p.m. That's the time. So we wanted to break the standard raid mold with her. We wanted to make her a really compelling encounter. So here's some of the things that we did. We concepted a 3-stage encounter. Stage 1 is the introduction. There she is sleeping, and you see her, and your guild charges in, and your main tank better turn her quick enough, or that guy you want to kick out of the guild is in the whelps, and and just kick the guy out already. He's just absorbing loot. Anyway, so then, we thought it was cool. You're fighting Onyxia. Oh, wow, she looks awesome. We're all in the right place. We wanted to mix it up. Let's have another stage where everybody changes roles. So, and also it was like this challenge to us, like, can we make her fly? And we did. So Onyxia flies. And then stage 3 is the all hell breaks loose stage. And that's where everybody better do the right things at the right time. So kind of like the grand finale. When we're making a raid encounter, we sit down and constantly ask ourselves, what is each class doing right now? If I'm a druid, what am I doing? Am I healing? Is there something for me to hibernate? If I'm a rogue, am I going to get ripped apart by the AE? If I'm a warrior, am I single tanking this or off tanking? We have to ask ourselves, what is each class doing? We never want to approach a raid from too far back and too big picture that we forget what it's like to be an individual player at that encounter at that time. So we also try to mix things up, and I think Onyxia is a good example of that, or like the Razorgore encounter. We don't want everything to be like this 30-minute snooze fest of, okay, here we go, everybody start doing DPS and healing, and that's all you're going to do for the next 30 minutes, because there's just nothing interesting about that. And we also don't want one boss to feel just like the next boss. So if you look at Molten Core, compare Magmadar to Lucifron. Within any raid dungeon, we also want the fights to feel very different. We don't want them to all feel the same. So we always have a duration in mind before implementing an encounter. Sometimes we come close to hitting these durations, sometimes we're way off. As an example, for Valenstraws, our whole vision for that encounter is that it would be a 2-minute fight. Or actually 3 minutes is the real timer, because then you're screwed. But so pacing is important in these fights. We don't want it ever to feel like something is dragging out. And if it ever feels like that, then we've done something wrong and we need to go back and fix it somehow. We want to challenge the players so they feel a sense of accomplishment. This is a real tricky one. You can turn that knob of difficulty up on the players. If you ratchet it up too high, it creates a lot of frustration on the player base. We try to make it challenging, but not too challenging at the same time. And then we constantly want to raise the bar on ourselves. And what I mean by this is come up with new encounters that we hadn't done before. So like in our dungeons, we come up with guys like Arcadus, which is this awesome titan who's, bringing guys out of stone form all around the room. And then we get to our raid encounter. It's like we have to do something a little bit more than that. This slide I call SMART. This is to address a lot of things that always comes up on the boards. How come you guys don't make a smart raid boss? Wouldn't a smart raid boss kill all the healers first? Okay, for 1 second, pretend that you play a priest. And let's pretend Onyxia is so brilliant that she's figured out somehow to kill the priest first. So your raid charges down into Onyxia's lair, and bam, 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 all your priests are killed. Did that somehow make the encounter more fun for anybody at that point? Everybody always likes to play the realism card, well, of course I would kill the priest if I was, but there's not really dragons at the end of the day, and they don't walk around with like helms of wrath stashed under their wings. So, sometimes you got to do stuff to address gameplay. I like to say that killing players is easy. So I think Jeff, if he wanted to, he could kill you in any way that you could possibly imagine. He could kill the druids by mind controlling the priests and having them kill the druids if he wanted to. And then Scott could send you to Thousand Needles, kill you, and break all your gear. We have amazing tools. It's not like we're limited by technology. We could kill you anytime we want, like in the beta. That's Magmadar and Stormwind, and those are real players. We could put everybody. We could put Ragnaros in Razor Hill. I think we did that. Nobody still to this day knows who put Ragnaros in Razor Hill, but he was there. So that's Magmadar in Stormwind. So killing players is really one of the easiest things that we can do. It doesn't even take a lot of thought. We can be really non-creative and just, cleave, but for 8 billion, and everybody's dead. So the point is, it's not like it's us against you guys. We're not trying to, Nefarian's not our baby and don't kill him. We put him in the game so you'll kill him, we want you to kill our raid monsters. We put loot on them because we expect you to kill those things. So you have to get away from this assumption that we have to have content that we just don't want the players to beat. We want you to beat our encounters, but we want the encounters to challenge you in a fun and creative way. We want you to, as players, to walk away and say, we really had to work on our strategy. We didn't get it on the first try. Maybe we didn't even get it on the first 2 weeks of trying, but we were able to, unify as a raid and beat this thing. So challenging players in a fun way is the designer's challenge. That's what we have to come up with. So this brings us to our next slide. These are raid creatures and who kills what the most. In one day, Valenstraws killed 24,000 people. And then you have the Bloodlord with 11,000 people and Fire Maws at 10,000. And I threw some other stuff in there, on the low end of the scale is the Rizashi Adder. That's one of the snakes in Zul'Gurub. 4,000, the Firewalker, which is just funny. I love watching people pull those, make the Paladin pull the Firewalker. I'm serious, too. It's anyway. As comparison, the Gadgetzan Bruiser is weighing in there, so maybe we should put purple loot on that guy or something. He's earning his keep goblin style. Also, the Defias Pillagers. I like to point out that the Alliance is not easy mode. Anybody who's been level 14 in Westfall, yeah, it's hard, man. Moonbrook, they're you see 4 of them start at once, and you're oh God, Sentinel Hill. So even with the best individual skilled players, and you put us all together in the same raid at Blizzard, and we suck. We are a great player. We made the game. We made the encounter. We know the strat. We have awesome loot. But we don't play together every day like you guys do. And we also, we don't care about DKP and all of this. We're not looking, when we engage a raid encounter, you'd be surprised at what a psychological difference that makes on a raid. So as an end result, we suck when we play as a raid as a whole, and we spaz out and we die like crazy. Oh my God. We had that one guy we're trying to do Hakar. We're testing him. And we know the strat. Jeff made up the encounter, and Jeff's telling us what to do, and he's like, all right, guys, just don't remove, the curse, whatever you do. And this dude is just spamming, and he's like, when we want the curse removed, we can't get it removed. But this one time, this guy, just everybody stripped of it. And sometimes things occur on production realms that cannot be simulated in-house. So a lot of the testing that we do is not actually on a production realm, but on our own personal servers. But so then we try to test it on the PTR too, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So a lot of players wanted a Blackwing Lair kept off the PTR. So players wanted the sense of competition and surprise revealed by keeping Blackwing Lair off the PTR. So we did that, but we felt like ultimately the zone was not tested as thoroughly as it needed to be, and it suffered for that. And for that, we apologize. We make mistakes. We never claim that we're infallible, and we learned from that. So as all of you guys know, we followed it up right away with Zul'Gurub. We put it on the test server, and we feel like it was a pretty solid zone when it came out. Relatively few bugs there. WoW was in alpha/beta for over 1 year, and our current patch turnaround cycle is somewhere from 3 to 8 weeks, and this includes development and testing. That's a really short period of time. WoW was so polished when it came out, the 1 to 59 game, because we had a long time to work on that content and make sure it's solid. Well, you take something like a zone like Blackwing Lair, under tremendous demand from the player base to get it out as quickly as possible, and it sort of puts an extra burden on us to make sure that we get extra testing or whatever. I just want to remind everybody that these patch cycles are extremely fast compared to normal development. So sometimes that causes us to let a bug here and there slip in, and we try to fix those as quickly as possible, obviously. I'll just finish up with looking at the big picture a little bit. Our goal is to have enough content to keep a full-time raiding guild busy each night of the week for a week. For the expansion, we want to deliver a menu of raid content. Kind of the way that raid content has worked out so far in WoW has been very linear, and we feel like this causes a lot of problems. And then finally, bigger is not always better. What I'm talking about is raid size. Even hardcore raid players, and I know lots of them, and I am one myself, appreciate a smaller raid. Adding more people to a raid does not make it better somehow. All it does is make us turn to math to go, okay, we've got to ramp the DPS up, and then they've got to ramp their character, power up, and it kind of does this whole inflation of the game that's not necessary. If we can keep raid sizes smaller, each individual who shows up counts for more, and their decisions feel more impactful. It's much cooler if each person in the raid can feel like they're contributing to something, rather than, okay, Jeff is DPS, Steven is healing, Alex is more DPS, Scott is healing. Like, we don't want it to be a numbers game. We want every individual who shows up on your raid to feel like they matter. So that's what I mean by bigger is not always better.
Started trying to come up with classes for World of Warcraft. We looked at a lot of different sources, but primarily what we were looking at was kind of traditional role-playing game classes, and then the other big thing we looked at, of course, was Warcraft 3. The first thing we did was we had to determine which classes we were really going to use. So one of the first approaches was another philosophy that we use at Blizzard a lot, which is called concentrated coolness. Rather than just having, let's say, a class and we just kind of throw a bunch of random stuff on it, we want kind of everything about the class to feel focused and to make sense within the context of that class. But we also wanted to make sure that there was a separation of roles between every class. Something we didn't want to do was have just a few classes and then have a bunch of hybrid classes that fit in between. Obviously, some classes ended up on the cutting room floor, and a couple of those classes we mentioned up here is the Necromancer was a popular unit in Warcraft 3. Obviously makes sense as a class. Didn't quite make it in. The Death Knight was another example of a very popular hero type in Warcraft 3 that didn't make it. So the origination of the mage came obviously from kind of traditional role-playing games, and it also came out of a couple units that we had in Warcraft 3, the Sorceress and the Archmage. So you can see some of the abilities on the mage really kind of look a little bit like the Warcraft 3 heroes. In particular, an emphasis on fire magic and frost magic. We really wanted to really kind of keep that same vibe and coolness with from the Warcraft 3 element. One of the major spells that never really came over, though, for example, was the Summon Water Elemental spell, and that's because what we wanted to see out of the mage was not really a pet class. We wanted to reserve that for other classes, and we felt like if we did that with the mage, it would actually kind of water down how the mage would play in a massively multiplayer game. And one of the spells that he had early in development was called Chains of Ice, which brings us to our crowd control philosophy with classes. So when Chains of Ice was on the mage, the way that it worked was that you could actually cast it on any enemy monster, and that monster would stay in place. And you can cast on any number of monsters. And what we found out very early on was all you had to do was take a mage to any dungeon, and you only had to fight one monster at a time, because the mage could cast Chains of Ice on all the rest of the monsters, and if you had a 6 pull, an 8 pull, whatever it was, the mage could lock them all down except for the one. And what we really wanted to achieve was to make sure that all the classes that had crowd control had very limited crowd control. We wanted to try to get everyone involved in the crowd control if possible. We didn't want to have like one class that really changed the entire game. So here's a comedic interlude about the mage. Thank you, Penny Arcade. I hope you guys have all gone by their booth. So just out of curiosity, how many people in the audience play Horde? And how many play Alliance? I think from yesterday we probably should have learned our lesson and actually separated the crowd, but the origination of the Paladin came pretty much straight from Warcraft 3, which was a little bit unique in that it's a very defensive class. You know, historically, if you look at traditional RPGs, you know, it's very much a hybrid warrior-priest class, and while our Paladin certainly had that, we really wanted him to concentrate on defense. We wanted the Paladin to be one of the easier classes to play. It was actually intentional, and the main reason was we found that the Paladin was a very attractive class for people to want to play initially because they felt like it was supposed to be a hybrid class. And hybrid classes tend to be easier to play and easier to solo in other massively multiplayer games. So we kind of took that to heart, and we really wanted to make sure that anyone that played the Paladin would kind of have an easier time. Now, there is a kind of a negative aspect that would come up with doing that, which is the Paladin, probably out of all of our classes, has the least amount of button mashing to do in combat. So that's something that we're continuing to look at and continuing to try to address. We want to try to make sure that the Paladin continues to be fairly easy to play, but we do want to make him a little more interactive over time. The Priest was probably a little more of a unique concept in our game than you might have seen in other traditional role-playing games. A lot of, I think, other RPGs have the idea of a cleric, which is a much more armored sort of priest class, and we wanted our priest to again separate itself a little bit from other RPGs, and that's how also we portrayed the priest in Warcraft 3, which is much more of a caster class. A lot of people, when they first started playing the priest, were surprised to see that they're wearing cloth robes and such. But that also allowed us to make the priest a little more interesting on the damage side. You can see, like, if you spec much more as a shadow priest, or even without being a shadow priest, our priest has a lot more damage potential than you might see with more of the traditional cleric. And then we came up with the idea of racial specific spells, which, you know, we decided to do with the priest, obviously, and you can see kind of each race of priest has a couple special spells they're able to do. And we thought that worked out pretty well, and we're looking at maybe expanding on that a lot more in the expansion set. The Shaman, again, kind of originated from Warcraft 3. It came out of a combination of the Orc caster units, the Witch Doctor, the Shaman, and the Farseer. One of the things, though, we did have to struggle with quite a bit early on was the portrayal of shamans in the Warcraft lore. In the Warcraft storyline, shamans are really portrayed much more as warriors, not as kind of the Native American medicine men or kind of what you might traditionally think of shamans. But the shamans that fight for the orcs, you know, they carry shields and swords, and they can stand up next to grunts or any warrior within the army. So that created a little bit of a problem within, you know, of course, trying to create some, you know, balanced classes within the game and wanting to stand different from the warrior but not be as powerful. So we kind of tried to make our shaman a little more of a mage fighter with the emphasis kind of mage first and fighter second. Initially, the shaman didn't have totems, and, you know, he wasn't a particularly interesting class when you compared him to, let's say, the mage or any other caster class. So that's where the idea for kind of incorporating some of the Witch Doctor elements came in. So we tried a few different totem approaches with the shaman. One approach was that every single totem spell could be cast separately. So that ended up with a whole lot of totem spam. You would end up with like 8 to 10 totems in every single combat, and you're just leaving them everywhere. And you might end up with 2 or 3 shamans in the group in a dungeon fight, and suddenly you got just these sticks poking all over the dungeon, and that was no good. So we said, okay, well, let's change that up And we tried for a little bit of time, okay, well maybe it's enough if he just has one totem. And that was really too far the other direction, since now it just felt like he had one spell gimmick, and that was no fun. So eventually we came up with the idea of, well, what if we kind of make totems around the elemental schools? The shaman anyways is already kind of in lore about the elements, so it ended up being kind of the right approach. It gave us the right mix between the two, and it also really felt correct within the lore. The warrior, probably more than some of the other classes we've talked about, came more from the traditional RPG side. We obviously have a lot of warrior-type units within the RTS game, but there really wasn't one unit we looked at and said, okay, well, that's the World of Warcraft warrior. We found very early on that it wasn't a particularly interesting class because you would just kind of wait for all your abilities to be up on their cooldown, and you're kind of just punching a metronome. You'd wait for the taunt ability to come up and then press that. You'd wait for the strike ability to come up and then press that. And there really weren't a lot of choices to make, since there really was no reason not to punch those abilities every time they came up. So we looked at kind of other genres for help, and what other genre to look at for a warrior than, let's say, fighting games, which are all about combat. So that's where we came up with the idea for the Rage Bar, which you kind of see some different ideas of that in fighting games. So the Hunter was another interesting class to develop. The Hunter originated in Warcraft 3 with the Headhunter, the Ranger, and the Huntress were all kind of classes or units that we looked to kind of develop the Hunter class. And in beta, the Hunter had a completely different way of playing than he does in live. He had something called a Focus Bar, which worked a little bit like the, it's like a Rage Bar or an Energy Bar, but instead it was a Focus Bar. And the way Focus worked was whenever you stood still, it would actually increase the amount of focus, and then you would get a certain amount of focus and then be able to use abilities. And we played with that for a long time, and we really liked the fact that it made him very unique. And it just ended up not being particularly fun, especially in a game where there's so much movement in PvP or even sometimes in PvE. Even though it was a different concept and was very unique, ultimately it ended up being less fun. So in the Hunter's case, we actually chose to go with more traditional mana bar and rely on his range combat and pets to really differentiate him from the other classes. But a lot of what we want to do with the Hunter, to not only just be a pet class in the sense like a Warlock, but we wanted you to care about your pet, which is why we put in all the notions of loyalty and the idea of pets having a diet. We really wanted you to kind of be invested with what pet you had. And the reason it's so, it takes a little bit of time to actually develop out a pet is because we wanted you to have that connection with the pet. And that was kind of the main differentiation between like Hunter pets and Warlock pets. The Rogue is one of our few classes that actually doesn't really have a Warcraft 3 equivalent. I guess the closest thing you might look at is in Frozen Throne, the Warden or something like that, but we really don't have a true rogue class in Warcraft 3. So the Rogue definitely came much more kind of from the traditional RPG approach. So originally we called the Rogue the Assassin. That was the first origination of the class. And the Assassin kind of sounds cooler, but ends up being a very narrow class when we started developing what he could do. Ended up being just about killing, and we wanted the Rogue to really bring a lot more to the table than just kind of what the Assassin sounded like he could do. The Rogue was another class that really, if you look at other games that have done Rogues, a lot of times they're very similar to kind of what I was talking about with my pet peeve with the Warrior was. You ended up with a very monotonous sort of class that you just waited for cooldowns and used that. And the Rogue in particular, we wanted to be a much more frenetic class to play. So we came up with the idea of the energy bar along with the combo system. And what we were trying to accomplish there was we wanted a combo system that was a little bit more free-form than you might see in other games. We didn't want to force you into combat chains where you had to use opening move A and then B and then C. We instead went to a much more open-ended approach where we had the idea of setup moves and finishing moves. And we've really tried hard to try to allow you a lot of freedom in what combinations you want to use. So the Warlock was one of the first classes we actually worked on. It was a class that I was pretty excited to work on initially, and the Warlock doesn't really have a class, from a traditional RPG or from the Warcraft 3 game that we're looking at. We're more looking at the Warcraft lore of Warlocks. Warlocks, and back when the orcs were part of the demonic horde portion where they were bloodlusted, they had warlocks in their lore, and they were, some of the more powerful sorcerers. So we thought that'd be a pretty neat class. And we also thought it'd be really interesting for the warlocks to be on the alliance side, so it'd kind of give, even among the more kind of good or friendly races, kind of a more evil class to play. So the warlocks obviously are all about fire and shadow magic, and that goes back to the demonic roots that I'm talking about with the orcs. Initially, we definitely wanted to do a pet class with the warlock, but we weren't sure exactly how we wanted the pets to work. We've seen other games where there'd be like a pet progression. You would get, let's say an initial pet, and then 10 levels later you get a better pet and never use the first pet again. So we really wanted to make sure that if we're going to put in all these really cool pets like imps and succubuses and what have you, we didn't want you to get to the maximum level and then you never see them again. You only see the top level pet. One approach we tried was the idea of every single warlock pet would be this extremely powerful sort of pet, and you would just bring them out for that fight, and then the next fight you use a different pet. So you might, in this fight, use the succubus because the succubus was really high damage or had crowd control, and the fight would end, and now the succubus might be on a 15-minute cooldown, so the next fight you'd be kind of forced to use, let's say, the infernal, and then he'd now be on a cooldown, so you'd be cycling these different pets. But ended up having a couple problems. One problem was that people wouldn't necessarily like cycling that. They kind of wanted to pick a pet for a particular fight and be able to stick with that. The other problem that really ended up was that combats could really last any variable length of time. You might see a fight last for 2 minutes, you might see a fight last for 6 minutes. And if the pet only lasted for 5 minutes, it really sucked for the group if the succubus suddenly disappeared. So that's where we eventually ended up with the approach we have now, which is kind of an interesting variety of different pets. And just like we develop the classes, we try to develop the pets kind of with their own role and their own purpose for being. The other interesting thing about the warlock came the notion of the pet bar. So you have a lot of control over not only what behaviors your pets did, but also whether or not they cast spells or not, or whether or not you want them to cast auto-cast spells, which is a concept we brought over from Warcraft 3, or do that yourself. So the druid came from Warcraft 3 again, and it was we kind of made our druid as a combination of all the different druids in Warcraft 3. The druid of the claw, the druid of the talon, and the keeper of the grove were all of our kind of druidic magic units in Warcraft 3. Because the druid was really introduced only in Warcraft 3, and it really had this very strong storyline to why they existed and why only the night elves had them. And we really struggled for a long time about whether or not, how true we wanted to stay to that lore. And like our creative director at first really was insistent that only night elf males could be druids. Because that's the way we portrayed the night elves in Warcraft 3. All the females were the fighters. They were the ones that, kind of wore the pants in the night elf family. The males stayed at home and wore the robes and, talked druidic magic. So that was kind of our concept for the night elves. And, when we kind of went forward into World of Warcraft, we struggled with that for a little while. And, initially the druid hit the cutting room floor. And then as we talked about the other classes and we talked about what would be a cool class, we kept on coming back to the druid and going, the druid would be really unique. So one of the things we can always do at Blizzard is change our story. And then we got the druid into the game. We really didn't want to have, just like 1 or 2 classes and then a whole bunch of hybrid classes that bridge the gap between the two. Going back to kind of what I was talking about originally, we want every kind of class to stand on its own 2 feet. But at the same time, we knew that a lot of people really enjoyed kind of that being able to dabble in a whole bunch of different classes. So we figured the druid would be our great opportunity to do that. And the vehicle that allowed us to do that was the whole concept of shape-shifting. Our druid, everything we do in Warcraft, we try to separate a little bit from what may have been done before. So we wanted our druid, rather than just kind of be a staff-wielding, robe-wearing tree hugger, we wanted to be a shapeshifter. Kind of that concept of, take that druidic concept over here and then take the idea of werewolves over here and put them together. And that was really what we ended up with our druid, and it gave us that great vehicle to make it a hybrid class.
So as we were developing the character classes in WoW, we were kind of slowly but surely coming to the realization that we really needed more ability for characters of a given class to differentiate themselves from other players of the same class. So at first it was simple stat customization, and we've got a screenshot here that kind of shows how that worked. At the time, very early on, all you could do is just select a stat when you leveled up and put some points into it. A lot of players would tend to kind of go into the cookie cutter builds, and it still didn't feel like there was a lot of customization there. So next we moved on to another system that was definitely more developed. And as you can see here, there's still the ability to have the stat point expenditures. Then we also added some other abilities like blocking mastery, defense mastery, dodge mastery. There were also some others below that, like fire damage increase, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those modifiers that you see there were flat amounts, such as increases your agility by 3, which meant that as your character kept leveling up, it felt like spending talent points earlier on really hadn't impacted your character very much. So at that point, we really realized that, okay, we need to do a lot more with the talent system we've done before. We'd also tried doing more with the secondary skill system, but we realized, well, because that's sort of the realm of the professions, we don't necessarily want the professions competing directly against attributes that you might be using to enhance your character's combat power. So some of the key concepts that we looked to for further evolving the talent system were we took some inspiration from Diablo 2. Some other core concepts were that we wanted a limited pool of points. We've heard a lot of suggestions over time because players have a natural tendency to want to continue to develop their characters almost indefinitely. That, hey, why don't you, as you keep gaining experience beyond the level cap, maybe that'll eventually contribute to gaining more talent points or something like that. But we actually felt that that waters down the core philosophy of having a limited pool of points so that you would actually have that as your character customization system. So this is kind of from the mindset of knowing what we wanted at this point. We want passive abilities, we want active abilities. How are we going to get there? How does it all work out? So we started with this UI mock-up here, which sort of has a motif of actually going left to right, where you would have tier 1 talents, for example, and you would purchase talents in tier 1, and once you got all the talents in that tier, it would automatically open up the uber talent at the end of that tier. The problem there is we didn't feel like the actual UI implementation was as clear as we wanted, and we also didn't feel like it left a lot of choices for the player. It felt like, well, it really only leaves the choice of, in this case, Fire, Frost, and Arcane. So here was another method that we talked about going with. You'd be able to select pretty much any talent there, assuming you had the points required to spend it, and you'd be able to spend multiple points in the talent, kind of like you can today. Now, the problem with this one, it didn't feel very visual. It didn't feel like it jumped out at you as to what it meant, like, and how it related to the exceptional talents that were down below. The ones that you see at the very bottom section, exceptional talents, would kind of be the 1-point talents that you automatically get if you spent enough points in the tree. In trying to go with something a little bit more visual, we went on to the next evolution. You have a set of talents that have prerequisites. There's a definite path that you can kind of see how you might work your way down the tree. Talents potentially would have multiple prerequisites. We thought this would actually be a pretty interesting way to go. This was really kind of the screenshot where we decided, you know what, I think we're on the right path. And I think we can go ahead and take this and refine it a little bit more and turn it into something that's actually really usable in the end. We started to realize as we did a little bit more design work in that previous one that we were going a little too far with the prerequisites. Not only should the prerequisites not necessarily completely constrain the player in terms of what choices they're able to make, but we also wanted to make sure that there were a lot of different paths to get down the tree. If you have too many prerequisites, it really cramps your ability to get down the tree in different ways. Some of the things that make our class balance a considerable challenge are that we have a lot of different types of gameplay. In addition, we have issues where sometimes our approach to a character class doesn't necessarily match the vision of what was intended for that character class. We've certainly seen this to some degree in the Paladin case. We always kind of imagined the Paladin class as being the holy warrior, where you would get in there with the warriors and you had your plate armor on so you could take the damage and you would be beating on the mob. And yes, you would be a healer in a backup situation, but that's not really how it's kind of played out over time because healing's such a strong mechanic. So we're always faced with these difficult choices when we see that, okay, well, something's really evolved kind of beyond our control in one direction. Should we either embrace that? Should we continue to go along with that direction? Or should we say, oh, no, wait a second, that isn't what we intended, and let's go this other direction?
Essentially, the Burning Crusade, the title of the new expansion set, refers to the Burning Legion's ongoing war to eradicate all life in the cosmos. In the prehistory of the universe, as planets lashed out, created this giant cosmos, a race of kind of mysterious godlike beings called Titans began to slowly move throughout the universe and cultivate these kind of burgeoning worlds. As they did this, they came across a number of like demonic races like the Eridar, the Pit Lords, the Nathrazim, a lot of the races that currently comprise the Burning Legion. As they met these races, they realized that the universe they're trying to form will never be safe as long as these forces were out there essentially, causing trouble. So one of the Titans, a guy named Sargeras, a name you guys may recognize from the series, Sargeras was a Titan in charge of punking down all these demons, right? He would kind of go and beat their heads in and essentially imprison them in some dark corner of the universe. As he started doing this, he went a little nuts. And ultimately developed the idea that creation has failed, that everything the Titans are trying to do is wrong and pointless, and that entropy and hate and destruction are the only absolutes in the universe. So he gets this bright idea: let's wreck everything. Let's follow in the Titans' wake and snuff out everything. It's got to end. It's just a big cosmic joke. To this end, Sargeras went back to this abyssal prison where he had kind of put all these bad guys, and he shattered it. And he brought all these guys out, and he bound them into one singular force known as the Burning Legion, and gave them one horrible commission: burn it all. The first invasion of the Burning Legion on Azeroth and the Night Elf heroes, principally, that rose up to halt the Legion's advance the first time. Those of you who have been following the RTS series, most recently Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos, pretty much chronicled round 2, when the Legion, pretty pissed off, showed up again to just end this planet that's in its way. And again, the Night Elf heroes from ages past came to the forefront and rallied the younger races, namely orcs and humans, to help them defeat the Legion and save their planet once again. We really want to stress that it is a cosmic conflict, and all of these things and all of these places and all of this history will come into play long term. We felt as our first expansion set outing, this really sets a tone. It sets a tone that this is a much bigger conflict than just this world and just these races in contention. Warcraft 2 expansion set was called Beyond the Dark Portal, and that storyline involved the orcs had done a few invasions on Azeroth, and the Alliance had come back and pushed the orcs back through the Dark Portal and into their homeworld of Draenor. And at the time, the orcish leader, a guy named Ner'zhul, who some of you may recognize as being 50% of our current Lich King, opened up a series of gateways on Draenor that led to other worlds. Like we said earlier, there are multiple worlds in the cosmos, and he figured, let's pick one and get the hell out. The problem in his genius plan was that these gateways in such close proximity began to rip the world of Draenor apart. Now, the human heroes at the time, there were 5 of them, I believe, that were principal heroes in that game. They realized that with the Dark Portal still open to Azeroth, if Draenor explodes, that resultant explosion could head back through the Dark Portal and kill millions on Azeroth. So they made a very selfless choice to destroy the Dark Portal from the Draenor side, and that they did. And so for years, those heroes have been presumed dead, and Draenor as a world, as a setting, has been presumed to be space dust. Actually, it's kind of cool for those of you in the know. The Valley of Heroes in Stormwind, as you roll into Stormwind, the big grand entrance, those 5 statues are of those 5 heroes. Kurdrin, Danath, Khadgar, Alaria, Turalyon, they're all kind of honored in the Valley of Heroes. Our second look at Draenor, what has become of it, occurred in the Warcraft 3 expansion set, The Frozen Throne. Almost said Beyond the Frozen Throne, which would have been stunning. In the Frozen Throne campaign, we see one of the former heroes of the setting, this guy named Illidan Stormrage, has gotten himself into some trouble with the Burning Legion, who all this time has still been out there. In an attempt to escape the Burning Legion, Illidan flees to Outland. He discovers that chunks of Draenor still exist, floating in the twisting nether as, let's say, for instance, a series of small continents all kind of bound together, floating in the astral plane. So Illidan very quickly, with his newfound allies, the Naga and the Blood Elves, we'll talk about Blood Elves in a minute, set out to take control of this very cool space. And as Illidan was hanging the curtains and making himself at home, he discovered that the gates that Ner'zhul had opened up years before were still standing. And they were still open to these other worlds in the universe. Given his paranoia and his need to not be found by the Burning Legion, Illidan set out to close all those portals. Essentially, that's the way Outland exists right now. Outland is kind of a closed pocket dimension. It has its own struggles and conflicts, but you have these gateways to other worlds that are now closed, and Illidan is pretty much the Don, right? He's in charge, he's the man, and his Naga and Blood Elf enforcers, and he's got other agents to bear, pretty much control current, present-day Outland. But these gateways that Illidan does not want open, they are our conduit to fighting the Legions. The trick is, we're going to go to Outland, and we're going to reopen those damn gates. And through those gates, we're going to take the fight to the Legion's doorstep. Because beyond Azeroth, the Burning Legion is attacking all of those planets. Years ago, in the development of Warcraft 3, there was one day where Night Elves happened. Remember Sam Didier, our art director, he had just done the perfect piece of art. It was the first Night Elf. I'm like, that's it. Wow, they're purple. You know, it was just such a, like just one of those ideas that you hope you have over the course of your career. It's like that, Sammy, that makes sense on every level. And I knew immediately at that moment that we were going to have to do something with High Elves, because just competition factor. One day, High Elves are going to have to get a facelift too, and they're going to have to be just as cool as that concept, or what I hope that concept's cool, y'all. I don't want to sound like that, but you know what I mean. At any rate. So we've always been excited to re-look at the High Elves and attempt to do something with them that, to our knowledge, has not been done in pop fantasy up to this point. You know, there's all sorts of cool worlds out there, right? But I don't think anyone's abused High Elves to this degree so far. So let me tell you a little bit about them. Again, I apologize for talking so much. That glazed look in your eyes, these guys have it like every day. It's horrible. Blood Elves are our High Elves. And to make a real long story short, they were once Night Elves. And back in the day, 10,000 years ago, they were exiled from their homeland because they just wouldn't stop playing with magic. And as one of our core themes in World of Warcraft, magic is absolutely corrupting. You shouldn't be using it. Blood Elves serve as our example of what happens to a group of people when they just don't stop playing with it, or abusing its power. That sounded really bad. I hope we're getting this on tape. You know how you try and prep and not say anything stupid in front of like 1,000 people? All good. So, Blood Elves, thank you. So like I was saying, Blood Elves were exiled from their homeland long ago. They sailed across the sea. They founded a new homeland called Quel'Thalas, and at the heart of this land, they had an artifact called the Sunwell. The Sunwell was a fount of energy that pretty much provided them with unlimited arcane energy. And even members of their society, over time, over the generations, even members of their society that did not practice magic, tailors and farmers, were all kind of subtly affected by the Sunwell and its energies. And ultimately, during Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos, Prince Arthas, the evil human warlord, rolled his undead army into Quel'Thalas and pretty much slaughtered over 90% of the High Elven race. And he rolled their real pretty kingdom as well. The Scourge also destroyed the Sunwell, which pretty much for the first time in the Elves' history severed their link to the arcane. Many of them didn't even know that they had become essentially addicted to magic, like on a racial level, on a genetic level. They needed to survive. So shortly after that sequence played out in Warcraft 3, and the Elves are no longer able to pull upon this power source that they had always used, they find themselves getting sick and dying by inches. And they realized that they were, in fact, addicted to magic, and suddenly the Night Elves were right. Oh, damn it, I can't stand when they're right. And they knew they were in trouble. And their leader at the time, a guy named Prince Kael'thas Sunstrider, came to the forefront, realized that his people were in trouble, that something drastic needed to be done. So Kael'thas made a deal with the devil named Illidan Stormrage. In exchange for his services and his people's services, Illidan taught Kael'thas and the Blood Elves, the now named Blood Elves, how to siphon demonic energies, how to siphon ambient arcane energies, from the air. And in doing so, he damned the last vestiges of the High Elven race to retain their magical addiction, but feed it with really unwholesome energies. Because of this, Actually, let me take a step back and explain the name Blood Elves. The name itself isn't in reference to anything dark. The name itself was chosen as a badge of honor to honor their fallen people, to honor their fallen homeland. So it's kind of like, we are those of the high elven blood. It's a mark of distinction that they survived the trials of their race. So jumping back into the present. Oh boy, can I jump back into the present? Let's rewind tape. Sorry, guys. It's a lot to juggle. The Blood Elves now, because they have been siphoning demonic energies, and they've been very overt about it, right? And they're prideful. They're powerful again. Their eyes are glowing green. They're very bold. They're much more aggressive than they used to be. We're starting to see the side effects of tampering with, it's not just arcane energy anymore, it's fel energy, right? For those of you in the know, fel energy is demonic energy. It's essentially entropic. It's essentially death energy. And they're really stoked about using this stuff and rebuilding their homeland. While they're doing this, their comrades, right, the Alliance, these guys that they've been partners with for years, if not generations, are starting to get really nervous around them. Whoa, guys, didn't the Night Elves warn you that this is kind of bad? You guys are starting to trip us out a little bit. Dwarves and humans don't want to play ball. They're not returning phone calls. The Night Elves can smell it on them. They can smell this demonic taint. They can smell it in their blood. Utterly disgusted. Actually, it remains to be seen if Night Elves would even, kill them on sight. It's unclear in my mind whether Night Elves would just be done with these guys after all these years. So the Blood Elves really, as they're rebuilding their homeland, don't have a whole lot of allies anymore. And they're happy about it. They could care less. They're on a road to power at any cost. The whole racial psychology is changing, given the trauma that they went through with their homeland and their people being destroyed. They could care less. They're going to do whatever they have to do. One other little point is that their leaders, Prince Kael'thas, that I spoke of a little earlier, I suggested that the Blood Elves have some kind of fealty to the demon Illidan. And if Illidan's an outland, it pretty much is that the elite Blood Elves are also an outland working for him. So the player Blood Elves, the ones that y'all will be creating and playing and adventuring with, are the Blood Elves that are still left on Azeroth and clearly not in Outland. And they're driven to rebuild their home and one day reach Outland. One of the big kind of caveats to being a Blood Elf is that they view Outland, where their leader is, they view it as Eden, as a paradise, as the promised land. And they're going to spend their careers up to level 55, something like that, working their way to get to Outland. That's what they need to do. Their homeland's great, all good, but Outland's where our destiny lies. And in that, they're going to be forced to make some decisions. If the Alliance will not open the Dark Portal and take them to Outland, someone will. So while it sounds a little funky to have elves of any stripe being part of the Horde, you'll see, as we unfold more information, and as we develop more, you'll see why. Why would they be part of the Horde? One of the funny little elements is the leader of the Forsaken, the Banshee Queen Sylvanas Windrunner, was upwards of 4 years ago the Ranger General of Quel'Thalas. Sylvanas, although cold and rotting and icky, still has a lot of love for Quel'Thalas. She still has a lot of love for her people and identifies with them on many fronts. So that could be an in for the Blood Elves. It's something certainly that they will leverage in their attempt to use the Horde to get what they need. So anyway, there's some vibe on that. How are we doing on time, guys? Woo! Okay, so holy cow, I'm through my list. So guys, that's really what else?
Nothing we could say. Top that.
What are you talking about, dude?
We got 35 more minutes, Chris.
Let me wing it a bit more. So Outland, right? If any of you remember the maps of, how many people in the room have played Warcraft 2X? Look at that. Old people, old school. Not that old, I know. My God, it was in my 20s when I did it. At any rate, a lot of the lands and the zones that we'll ultimately build for Outland, let me ask, hold on, sidebar. Are we talking about the zones we're doing in Outland? Yeah. All good? Okay, back to our programming. My hard drive's full. I'm really not good with short-term memory. At any rate, a lot of the lands and the places and the kind of the unique locations that were featured in Warcraft 2 X will play out in Outland. We're really trying to be as true to the continuity and as true to the lay of the land and the creatures and all that as possible. I don't remember where I was going. Maybe we should just open it up for questions. Why don't we just open it up for questions? I'm done.
Are you done?
I may be. It's probably best that I be done. You guys want to do questions now? Let's do that. All right.
Okay.
All right. This question's kind of inevitable. I know you probably don't want to address it, but why are there 2 Hakars in Warcraft lore?
Did Richard Knack ask you to ask that? Did he roll me on that? Damn it.
Number 2.
I'll roll that out. I'll let the guys off the hook. The answer is my bad. And how I was talking about the hard drive being full, essentially what happened is that in the War of the Ancients trilogy, the first book, Richard had created a character named Hakar. I think it was Hakar the Houndmaster, if memory serves. Pretty cool demon character who's one of the agents of the Burning Legion. And I think what happened, which happens more often than I really want to admit, it was just such a cool name, it was just kind of jumbling around in the hard drive. And when I went to jam out Hakar the Soul Flayer, Hakar, I'm a genius, you know? These guys roll me on that like daily, right? Like, dude, you know Luke Skywalker's already taken, right? Who took it, you know? So that was my bad. So I'll try not to do those anymore.
In alpha and early beta, there was talk about having each race having a quest line, a life quest series, and that talk stopped midway through beta and haven't heard anything about it since. Is there still a plan?
Sure. What we decided to do instead, because originally we started work on life quests and we found that they were actually becoming too specific to the race, and the fact that it was like every undead guy was like, oh, I must go back and rescue my father, and then there's another undead guy like, oh, your father died too and he needs rescue. You know, so we started realizing that these cool individual quests weren't that cool and individual after a while. So what we more steered in the direction of was just doing epic quest lines at the high level. You know, like somebody mentioned the Onyxia Horde quest, you know, Love It or Hate It is a very epic quest line, or all of the Darrowshire quests, that sort of thing. So we'd rather sort of get more stories based around the NPCs than try to tell you, the character, what your life story is. Only you know what your story is. You know, were you wearing full burnished chain at level 18 and, you know, you really hated Redridge, but you know, thought Silverpine was a great zone or something like that. But we didn't want to like make this canned story and force you to think, oh, I got abandoned and he was abandoned too and him too, and now we're all not abandoned. So we steered away from that direction when we felt like the quests were getting too canned.
One of the core philosophies that we sort of began with was this philosophy that a battleground should be a destination for rewarding objective-based team PvP. We also want for this PvP experience to feel like it's very team-based. We want it to feel like, hey, I'm part of a team that I know that going into the game, when I created my character, I knew that I became part of that team, and we're all going to be working together for the same objectives. And by doing that, we try to make sure that the Horde and Alliance are pitted against each other, and that's the central theme to all the PvP in the game. In addition, we want our battlegrounds to feel like Warcraft 3 meets Battlefield 1942. One of the key features here is that we want the battlegrounds to complement the existing game world. We want to make sure that the battlegrounds don't feel like they're completely separated or have nothing to do with the game world, both in terms of lore and in terms of gameplay. For example, we have the struggle between the Warsong Outriders and the Silverwing Sentinels, and we've tried to ensure that it feels like that makes sense within what's going on in the Ashenvale Barrens area. One of our final philosophies is that battlegrounds should impact the outdoor game world. And I'll be the first to admit that, yeah, you're right, we haven't done that yet. But it's certainly something that we feel is important, and it's something that we're going to be working toward over time. That when we had outdoor PvP before we had the battlegrounds, the PvP was kind of chaotic and messy, but it felt meaningful. Well, when you have a good fight in the battleground, it feels clean and objective-based and all that, but it doesn't actually feel meaningful anymore. So we want to make sure that we blend the two of those aspects and come out with a PvP system that in the end is a lot more interesting as a whole. So Alterac Valley, it actually went through a lot of very significant changes even before it went live. When we concepted it, we actually concepted it as a non-instance persistent zone. What we felt like this was going to get us is it was going to get us the feeling that it was very meaningful, because whatever happened in the Battleground, since there was only one of them, was meaningful to anybody on that server. There were also pitfalls with this. We knew kind of going into it that, well, we can't really predict effectively how many players are going to go in there. You know, maybe you might show up at one point and there won't be anybody in there on the opposing team. Maybe you'll show up and you'll be heavily outnumbered. We really don't have any control over that as designers if we go with a non-instance persistent kind of style, even though it has more kind of clear-cut benefits as far as knowing that the zone is always going to be available to people, and also knowing that anything that happens in there feels meaningful to everybody as a whole. We put in quests and NPCs and filled that zone up with a lot of content to try to make sure that, okay, well, this will solve the case where you're going in there and you really don't know if there are enough enemies, or possibly there's a numerical imbalance. The NPCs will kind of help compensate for that if we have enough, defensive natured NPCs. However, as we went on, we started to realize that because of the demand we were seeing for Battlegrounds, we started to realize that, wow, the community is really built up around Battlegrounds and really has high expectations for them. And we were starting to realize that, you know what, there may be way too many people for one zone to support. Alterac Valley being our first Battleground kind of taught us a lot of different things about how Battlegrounds should and perhaps should not work. For example, in a Battleground, players find that dying to other players is okay, but dying to NPCs really feels kind of bad. In a Battleground, quest objectives need to meet, they need to match the Battleground objectives as a whole. I don't know if a lot of you can see it, but it says LFG Korak, please send tell. So that was definitely an example of one of our quests that didn't line up with the overall quest objectives. We had Korak, we had an objective out there to kill a troll boss that had nothing to do with winning or losing the Battleground, and it rewarded you with some really pretty good loot if you completed the quest. So a lot of players out there that went to Alterac Valley weren't even necessarily interested in winning or losing. All they really cared about was, I just want to kill Korak and get my ice barb spear or whatever and get out of here. So another lesson that we learned was we don't want to make players compete for loot in a Battleground. So what this had the side effect of doing is it caused players to compete over loot. They'd do things like, ninja loot each other's kills. You would have, rogues going around stealth, doing nothing but looting. And that really clearly does not match up with wanting to have team-based behavior. Another lesson that we learned was that the capture and respawn points shouldn't be in physically the same location. There should at least be some amount of meaningful separation geographically between them. Epic, big fights, good. But a giant cluster at the graveyard, bad. So that brings us to the next point, which is that players want a feeling of obtainable resolution. They don't want to get in there, fight for a long time, and then have to leave. Some of you have probably heard that we were working on a Battleground named Ajara Crater some number of months ago. We were actually working on it in tandem with Alterac Valley. And as a result, it shared a lot of the basic design philosophies and tenets that we use for Alterac Valley. Even the way the very map was built wasn't going to lend itself well to a very different style of gameplay. A lot of us want a Battleground that has that very obtainable resolution that you can win or lose in the space of a short amount of time. Another point that they were making, which was that they didn't want the Battleground to feel like it had too much going on. Another thing that players wanted on the team was a Battleground that had small teams. So something that we wanted was, the 40-on-40 battle in Alterac Valley, it feels pretty epic, and there are definitely things to be said for that. You want some variety, and sometimes you just feel like going into what feels like a battle between armies. But at the same time, there are times when you feel like getting a small fight, when you feel like, I want that little 5-on-5 or that 10-on-10, where it feels like the actions I have, my skill in the Battleground might actually impact the outcome of the battle. In addition, to go with that, we wanted a geographically small map, because it's not particularly fun if you have a small number of players and you have a very large map. You go around spending a lot of time just looking for people instead of killing them. With Warsong Gulch, the prototyping began much earlier. So what we did is we just created a very basic, rough map, got in there and just started running around the zone, getting a feel for how big it was, fighting each other, trying to get a sense for what kind of gameplay was going to fit well within it. We were, running around, kind of trying to get a feel for, well, what type of gameplay should it be? Should it be deathmatch? That was kind of a natural direction for us to go. It was that, oh, maybe you'll just get in there, you'll kill people a certain number of times, they can only respawn a certain number of times, and after that they're out of there, and last man standing wins. But as we were kind of working on the zone and developing the way the bases would work, we were realizing, you know what, this might actually be a lot more fun as a capture the flag mechanic. Another key here was that we wanted to have symmetrical bases, and we wanted to make sure that a lot of the emphasis is on balance. We wanted to make sure a lot of the emphasis was on, this is a 10-on-10 fight between fairly balanced teams that will resolve because of player skill. So we didn't want to have a whole lot of external factors that were going to change that feeling of balance. As a result, we put a lot of thought into the base design. We were like, well, we want symmetrical bases, we want capture the flag format. So we turned to one of our level designers who's actually a very pretty well-known Quake 3 mod builder. So we said, hey, can you build us a base that has all those very fundamental principles that make CTF work very well, such as not having too many choke points, too many areas where you can stand in one spot and always be able to see if somebody's coming up on you, be safe from anyone coming up on you from behind, that kind of thing. We want to avoid those. And after prototyping it, we started to try to figure out, okay, what's the best way that we can really weave this into the lore of the game world? Right from the get-go, we started to say, you know what? It seems like it'd be kind of cool if we have a Battleground that can support multiple level ranges. So we wanted to fit it into the existing game world in a place where it felt like it made sense in terms of had to be a place where there was going to be conflict between Alliance and Horde, and it also had to be somewhere that wasn't necessarily in a high level zone.
So the first note is that graveyard placement could have been better. How many of you have been on a Warsong team and you crack into the enemy's base and you kill all their defenders? If they have defenders there, you grab the flag, you run out, and then they're all standing right there in the graveyard. Yeah. All right, so that was our fault. Graveyard placement could have been better. So had we to do it over, we'd probably put the graveyards off to the side more, or perhaps even back in the base itself. So that way there was a real feeling of accomplishment and permanence to clearing those bases. Now, what we didn't want to do with the graveyards was just make the respawn time longer. When you're approaching something from a design standpoint, think about what's it like in the other guy's shoes. If you die, you don't have to wait a long time to respawn. So the birth of the Zerg, and I illustrate this with a picture. On the test server, Warsong Gulch was awesome. We copied our characters from the production realms, and we were playing along with you guys, and those were some great matches that we had on the test server. We'd all get in there and who's playing offense, who's playing defense, and it was like we were soccer coaches or something. And then after 2 weeks, when Warsong Gulch had been live, the Zerg just started, and everybody was in those 10-man groups, and that was the only way it was going to work. It was our 10, then their 10, and we just grabbed the flag and we'll stand on the graveyard. And so we realized that was a problem. There's a lot of people who actually liked that gameplay. Warsong Gulch was supposed to be our, I want to play a Battleground on my lunch break. Battles can go on for 2 hours sometimes with really good teams. Or how many of you in, just standard sort of dungeon gear, you're the warrior and with 3 pieces of valor, and you show up and you think you're pretty badass, and then you look at the other team and they're all in Blackwing Lair gear, the other guy's got full wrath, and you're like, oh God, it's going to be one of those days. So I think a lot of us have been in that situation where you just see that, everybody's got glowing particles and you can't even see their head because the shoulder pads are so big. You just want to grab your own flag and run it over there for them. Just make it end. So we recognized that was a problem. Losing is not fun, and the screenshot really tells it on this one. That's real. We didn't stage that screenshot. That's an actual Warsong Gulch that took place. So with Gurubashi Catacombs, it was going to take place in Stranglethorn Vale at the Gurubashi Arena, which most of you guys know. There's a little goblin quest out there, free-for-all PvP. This was going to be the area beneath that, where they held the tigers, that they would release those out. And we wanted to really go for that whole Stranglethorn vibe. We felt like there's a good Horde Alliance mix in Stranglethorn and some good tensions already there. As we were playtesting, we're like, capture the flag is awesome. Let's try deathmatch out. our whole thought process going into it was that this was going to be a 5-on-5 single elimination deathmatch map. There's a lot of us at Blizzard who like games like Counter-Strike and Quake and Half-Life and Unreal and all of these first-person shooters where, you know, it's a single elimination deathmatch. We thought it'd be a great thing. So we designed a map specifically for that for World of Warcraft. We started very early prototyping on this one. The screenshot, I think, is the only one that exists of the Gurubashi playtest. And we spent a whole afternoon playing on the map. You can see the textures are very rough. They're not really applied right. There's been no art treatment to this map. It's solely so we could run around it as a playtest and see if we wanted to take it further. You know, everything sounds great on paper, or I should say on the forums, but actually playing in World of Warcraft is a different story sometimes. So we learned a lot from the Gurubashi playtest. World of Warcraft is not a first-person shooter. Well, lots of first-person shooters, you know, everybody is exactly equal, and it just depends. As you pick up the rocket gun or the grenade launcher, or maybe it is a class-based first-person shooter, and, you know, Tom just killed me with his anti-tank guy, so I can come back instantly as infantry, or next time as a sniper. Well, WoW is not like that. You have your character, like it or not, for a long period of time. There's also no railgun, one-shot sniper kills. There's no headshots in World of Warcraft. These are all things that really drive gameplay dynamics in first-person shooter deathmatch maps. So deathmatch doesn't really work out in WoW PvP. It's not fun being the healer in single elimination deathmatch. You guys all know what to do. If a group is coming at you and you've got that big Tauren warrior, but that undead priest casting bubble in the back, bam, that guy's got to die, you know? He's just, and he's wearing a dress and he dies easily. The Tauren takes forever to kill, you know? We had all these guys who like play rogues and like, yeah, it's awesome. We can't wait to put it in the game. But, you know, we have to kind of look out for the big picture there. So there's a lot of coolness in that Gurubashi catacombs, you know, that 5-on-5. There's something to be said for that. So we didn't just dismiss it and say, no, that was a bad idea. We just felt like that wasn't a good battleground. But the idea of a group duel, that's something that we'd like to explore further down the road. So we started work on a map called Arathi Basin at this point. The goal here was get back to our design philosophy vision. Warcraft 3 meets Battlefield 1942. We wanted lots of players in Arathi Basin. Actually, the original vision for Arathi Basin was that it was going to be 30-on-30. As we started playtesting, we'd kind of slide back and forth how many players we allowed in, and we finally nailed it down to 15 just because it felt right and it played right at that. The goal on Arathi Basin was a simple design. This was going to make it accessible to as many people as possible, and very understandable sort of map. So this was the early plan. The blue base is the Alliance and the red base is the Horde. That's flipped upside down. And then, like, I used this crazy gradient style to show the mine was going to be down low and the thing on the hill, but that's advanced Photoshop right there. So very simple design. That was the goal for this. And the whole thought in the design itself was, how can we get people to spread out? Warsong Gulch evolved into the 10-on-10. So we were thinking, you know, how are we going to get people to really spread out? Arathi Basin works in such a way where if you stay with 15 people the whole time, you're not going to win. So part of making this work was clear points of interest. This is the first prototype. We actually played it at this point. So very early on, we just like to get something in the game and then play it. We can very quickly get together, okay, let's try it 20-on-20. And when we do something like this, it allows us to test out, you know, how quickly can I get from the stables to the town hall? It was a town hall at the time. How quickly can I get there on an epic mount, on a regular horse, or just on foot? Because if at this stage we want to move something or totally remove like the lumber mill, it's very easy, and we didn't just set an artist back, you know, 6 weeks in his time. The points of interest had to be visible from any spot. We thought that would make it accessible in the battleground too. Like from right here, I can see the mine, I can see the center of the map, I can actually see beyond the map a little bit. I can see the blacksmith and the lumber mill. In our Battlegrounds, we have an expanded area of interest where you can see all of the characters all over the map. We kind of got away from the lore-based names like Stonehearth and Iceblood and all of those names where you might not necessarily know where that was. There's only one mill in Arathi Basin, so if somebody says mill, you can visually recognize it and you know exactly where they're going to go. We also came up with the thought that we didn't want to just reward the winners, and we did this through our resource system. Even if you lose, you walk away with something from the battleground. So Arathi Basin was the first battleground to do that, and then later, more recently, we've implemented our token quest system, so people in Warsong Gulch and Alterac Valley are also rewarded a little bit, even if they lose. Of course, the winners are always rewarded more. Hey everybody, how you doing? Everybody's eyes are a little bit red today as compared to yesterday, we're noticing. Anyway, so the first thing we'll talk about is level range coverage. What we mean by this is when we started out designing World of Warcraft, we realized that something that makes an MMO a lot of fun for players is not feeling like they're funneled through content, like they only have one choice at one time. So when I talk about level range coverage, what I mean is that we also didn't want to start the dungeons off too early because it takes a little bit more organization to do a dungeon than it does the outdoor world. So our lowest level dungeon is Ragefire Chasm. One way to get people to go to dungeons to have some fun with our boss encounters is put really good loot there. We figured out that the experience in a dungeon is actually better than the outdoor world, but there are a few factors that come into play that make it more efficient to level up in the outdoor world. For example, you've got to get a group together to form up and even go to a dungeon. There's a travel time associated with getting to a dungeon. Dungeons require a much more tactical approach to combat. You don't just sort of smash through a field of boars, you know, doing thunderclap if you're the warrior, like, just aggro it all, I need XP. So kind of slow you down a little bit in dungeons. Our goal towards the Burning Crusade is to try to get back to where the experience feels meaningful in a dungeon. So when you're leveling up to 60 through 70, you don't just shoot to the end and then do the dungeons. We want you to do the dungeons as you level up. So that's something we're going to focus on for the Burning Crusade. Anyway, we want an epic feel and sense of danger. This usually happens in the form of bugs where like Mortal Strike's doing 4 times the damage than it's supposed to, but occasionally we put really dangerous bosses and achieve that. And even if you look at the background picture of Stratholme all burning and stuff, it feels pretty dangerous. Elite NPCs. So elite NPCs are why our dungeons work. When we started making World of Warcraft, the first thing we focused on was iterating on our outdoor world combat, like, you know, go kill boars in Westfall and all that kind of stuff. And we just kept iterating on the combat till it felt really fun. Like, am I pressing buttons enough of the time but not just mashing them? Getting that kind of fine-tuned balance on how does combat feel from a pacing standpoint. I don't know how many of you have ever taken a group of 5 out into an exterior zone and just sort of trounced over non-elite creatures, but it's ridiculous. You don't even get a chance to use your spells and abilities. So we came up with the concept of elite NPCs. They have better loot on them, more hit points, they do more damage, but it requires a group to sort of take them down in a lot of cases. And we did this so that the class dependencies would all play out. You know, the warrior needs that priest healing, and you might need crowd control and all these sorts of things. Players want a sense of progression in a dungeon. Basically, I like to use the dev mines as an example. As you start clearing through, the rooms change. You see the mast room where they're building the mast for the ships, and then you get down to the foundry where they, you know, pour all the stuff to smelt the cannons or whatever. You finally get to the very end, and you get that big grand reveal of the Juggernaut, you know, the boat right at the end, and it gives players that sense of progression. We want to vary the points of interest, so seeing too much of the same thing is tedious. A good example of this, again, is Stratholme, where you have the whole section that's sort of clean and pristine, where the Scarlet Crusade is pulled up and they're sort of fighting back against the Scourge. Looks very different than the dead side with all the Warcraft 3 ziggurats and the burning houses. You'd think the houses like would burn out and just be ash after a while. It's like Pirates of the Caribbean, they're still going. Mix up the pulls. So by this, we mean that you want to fight different creatures as you go through the dungeon. And not just different looking models of creatures, but you want to fight, casters. This guy's an AE caster. This guy's a warrior. This guy is a paladin type mob. Like really mix up the combinations of the pulls. Have some AE pulls in there. Make groups move through a dungeon and let everyone in the party experience it. We really wanted to get that feel of a dungeon crawl going. We felt like we spent so much time putting a lot of story and lore into the dungeons, and our artists just make every little area look so cool. They slave over the details that it'd just be tragic to have a dungeon where everybody sits in a corner, then the one cool guy gets to run out and I'm going to shoot my bow, and you guys just sit here all night long, and I'll just keep bringing them to you. We don't think pulling is a bad or a broken mechanic. We just want you to sort of pick your puller for your group and then lead the group through the dungeon. So I think pulling is a great way for individual players to show a lot of skill, and you can combo with like hunters and rogues and do some really interesting stuff in dungeons. But at the same time, we want to make sure the priest who's like told to sit in the back gets to actually move through the dungeon and see all the cool rooms. So try to make every class shine. Everything from the normal pulls that lead up to the bosses, and including the bosses, we're always asking ourselves, what do the different classes have to do in this particular encounter? We always try to come up with sort of unique creatures and unique areas to let everybody's spell shine. Another example I used yesterday was in Dire Maul, in the West Wing, on the upper tier there's a bunch of undead stuff. And at first, when we were playtesting, we're like, well, this is pretty cool. The pulls feel fun and everything. But somebody brought up the point, well, let's try it with a druid now. So we swapped the priest out, and we put a druid in the group, and suddenly we couldn't beat the pulls. So what we decided that night as we were tuning the dungeon is, let's switch one of the undead creatures out for those fairy dragons that are up there. And that'll allow druids to now hibernate one. So that's something that we kind of have to work closely with the class designers. Everything that we do affects them, and everything they do affects us. We also felt like boss pacing is important. There's sort of only so long you can go without getting loot before you start getting cranky, and then suddenly, I'm going link dead. I don't know what's causing it. And we've all seen that. Or, my mom just got home. I have to AFK out. And it's like, if loot is dropping more frequently, we feel like that priest is more likely to stay logged in. So we're not afraid to go back and fix stuff, and we're the first to admit that we make mistakes, so it happens. One of the things that I know I was most excited about when we first started working on the game was we decided to instance the dungeons. The number one reason, in my opinion, to instance the dungeon is to avoid the negative player collision that can occur. Even players who are on the same alliance, if they're going for the same thing and not in the same group, it gets very ugly. Everybody likes being out in the world and affecting what everybody else is doing, but there comes that part in your play experience where you just want to do a dungeon and you don't want to worry about stepping on other people's toes or competing with spawns. You want to have that really highly tailored, well-crafted gameplay experience. And we felt like instancing would sort of get around that. Another great thing is that the boss is always up. Imagine if we didn't instance Strathholm. How often would you see Baron Rivendare? Never, exactly. We can do highly scripted encounters like the Wailing Caverns Escort, where you take the druid through and he wakes Nerlax and you fight the big Murloc. You can't do that in a single player dungeon. Another example I like to bring up is that of locked doors. If we put a locked door in a dungeon, it sort of requires you to have an engineer, a blacksmith, or a rogue there, and that locked door is suddenly a true obstacle to you. But if we put that locked door out in the outside world and Corey comes along and unlocks it, well, too bad. The 3,000 other people on the server can come and just get through that locked door. Also lets us put traps and ambushes and that sort of thing. Because we know how much you guys love traps, like the crates in Strathhome. Dude, just no crate quest this run. We just want to farm legs. So we also put public areas in front of our dungeons. So like to use the dead mines as an example, there's that area with the undead, and there's a lot of caverns with miners that aren't instants. We did this for a couple of reasons to make the chance that you could run into other people. You could like duo or trio that front section and hook up with other people. Or there's some people who just don't want to go in the instance, but sort of test the waters, and then there's like the Scarlet Monastery has that little vestibule before the 4 doors. And that's always fun on the PvP servers too. It's the unannounced battleground called the Scarlet Monastery public area. The Horde have an advantage because they're like not flagged, so they're all standing there blue, like, oh, come on, dude, just run in here. Just open the door. Micro dungeons. When you go into Northshire and you level up your first human and you have that little gold mine right there, or if you're an orc in the Valley of Trials and there's that mountain cave, or the crypts out in Duskwood, like the Ravenhill Cemetery, we call those micro dungeons. So those are public dungeons that are not instanced, and they're usually, most of the time, tuned for the solo player, because we wanted solo players to sort of be able to have a dungeon experience if they wanted it and not have to group up and go into the dungeon. So instance dungeons are kind of for groups, and then those dungeons, those little micro dungeons out in the world is our solution for solo players. I'll talk a little bit about dungeon caps, and by what I mean by this is like on Dire Maul, for example, we only let 5 people in the dungeon. In the beta, we didn't have any caps. So it was really cool watching 40 people try to take on Baron Rivendare and lose. I have screenshots of that too. and you know what it is? I actually watched, because in beta it was really interesting to watch, because we can jump around and sort of spy on what everybody's doing. And there was like this hardcore group of 5 people doing Strathhome, and they started at the same time as this other group doing, I think it was a 20-person group. Well, it's so hard to get 20 people to like pay attention and not spaz out in general. The 20 people took longer to clear the dungeon, and eventually they just wiped out and stopped. Whereas the 5 people, because they're all there paying attention, clearing their way through, did much better. And then, like I said, we watched 40 people wipe on Baron Rivendare. Now, in all fairness, I think like 3 of them charged, and then there's like the 37 standing back as the doors close. So we found that players, as much as they like to say they like the skill and the challenge and whatever, if there's good loot lying somewhere in the world, they will take the path of least resistance to get it. It's not bad to take the path of least resistance, but we need to do things as game developers to ensure that your play experience is as fun as possible. So when a dungeon cap is exceeded, the perception of the quality of the overall experience goes down. The number one example that jumps into my head when I talk about this bullet point is Upper Blackrock Spire. A lot of players think that Upper Blackrock Spire is not challenging enough. Man, our guild has done it 40 times, and I can fall asleep on the raid. It doesn't even matter anymore. And that's because the majority of people are doing it with 15 people. That dungeon was tuned, that Upper Blackrock Spire, what's his name? Emberseer, Pyro Guard Emberseer. From beyond that room on was tuned for 10 people only. And Pyro, the Emberseer fight was actually tuned for 5 people. I think it's one of the funnest fights ever with 5 people. With 15 people, it goes into that category of like, what the hell were they thinking? This, like, boom, everything's dead. And like, is that guy gonna bust out yet? Because, So it was our fault as developers for not putting the cap in the first place. We were just a little bit reluctant because we were coming from beta where the sky was the limit. So, it's really hard. You don't want to upset the community, but at the same time, sometimes it's actually for their own good in the long run. Nobody ever wants to nerf anything or take anything out that players know and love. But I think dungeon caps is one of those examples. We always hear the counter argument of, man, I want to play WoW however I want to play it. And if for me it's fun to show up with 39 of my friends, who are you to tell me otherwise? And all of these kind of things. I always think back to this day, one of our programmers came to me in beta and said, one of our programmers, he said, I did Wailing Caverns last night, and I just think that end fight goes too fast. I think you should give the boss more hit points. And I'm like, well, that's a level 22 boss, you know, we don't want him that hard, you're supposed to beat it. It turns out that he was a level 29 paladin, and he was grouped with 20 people doing Wailing Caverns. And his whole impression, and his friends, because he played with his friends, their impression was that Wailing Caverns was a crappy dungeon that wasn't tuned well. There's that obligation that if the game allows you to put more people in your group, you're going to do it. Any changes, even good ones, are perceived as scary or bad by the community as a whole. When we got ready to release Dire Maul to the community, we said that we were going to cap it at 5. And we got really mixed reviews on this. A lot of people were super excited by that. And then there was a lot of people who said, you know, you're breaking the game. We like hitting these things with 10. But I feel the end result is most people recognize that Dire Maul is tuned for the proper cap and actually plays out much better. Change is necessary in a living, breathing game such as World of Warcraft or any persistent online game. This applies to everything from game design to programming to art, everything that we're working on in WoW. You often see the criticism on the boards like, oh, they made us beta test this and we're paying for it or whatever. But that's not really true. We have to stop and look at what an MMO is. It's a totally different kind of game. You guys are part of the development process. This game is being built around you. We felt like the players had a need for a stepping stone dungeon between Upper Blackrock Spire and Molten Core. This was the community who asked us for it. We shift our development priorities around and made Zul'Gurub a 20-man raid zone. That was purely because the community said this is something that we need in our game. The game is yours too, and if you say, you know, Scholomance really sucks, nobody likes to do it, guess what? We're grouping up on the live realms with our actual characters. All right, tonight we're going to analyze everything that's wrong with Scholomance and go back and change it. So the game is going to change, and it's changing because we're all part of the game development of World of Warcraft as a community and as a development team. We all kind of want to work together and bring the game up together, you know, as something that we're building. It's going to change for better or for worse, hopefully more for better. So we've learned a lot, mostly never to read the forum. No, I'm just kidding. Oh, I want to just get something out here right away. Speaking of the forums, we only read threads that either have our names in all caps or that say blue, respond blue. That's the only way we ever read a thread. Otherwise, we're like, what are these guys talking about? They're just posting craziness. Okay, so dungeons need tight level ranges. Early on, when we were building World of Warcraft and our combat system, we had no way of scaling difficulty. So in order to make a boss more difficult, we used to have to raise his level up. Van Cleef is 22 in the Dead Mines, while the front creatures in the Dead Mines are level 15. But it doesn't really work in the end. I mean, it's still a very fun dungeon and we love it, but we learned a lot of lessons from that. What we came away with from the Dead Mines example is that winged dungeons allow players to define their play experience. We always come back to the monastery on this. So if I'm level 30 and I show up at the Scarlet Monastery, I have no chance of beating Mograine and Whitemane in the Cathedral. There's just no way I'm going to beat them. But I have a very good chance of having success in the Graveyard Wing. So Monastery lets players define what they want to do, like casual and hardcore is another example. If I only have like 40 minutes to play at night, I can go and I can do one wing of the Monastery. Conversely, if I'm the type that's playing like 14 hours a day and I want to cycle through every wing of the Monastery, I can do it and have it feel like a cohesive dungeon experience. So for each level range, a dungeon serves a different purpose. Level up dungeons, and by that I mean a dungeon from 1 to 59, let's say, serves a very different purpose than an endgame dungeon. Most players on what I call a level up dungeon go there once or maybe twice. They don't want to spend a lot of time doing the dungeon over and over again. In fact, they get resentful if they feel like they have to do the dungeon over and over again. Whereas an endgame dungeon, such as, let's say, Blackrock Spire or Strathholm, Dire Maul, Skull-Amounts, one of those need to be compelling to players many different times. They're going to want to do those over and over to get the different loot. The loot now is loot that they're going to keep on their character for a much longer time than like Shadowfang loot. So knowing this, it really helps us when we're making expansion dungeons. You know, Hellfire Citadel is one of our sort of lower level dungeons, lower level being like 60 something, but lower level dungeons in the expansion versus like Tempest Keep, which is an endgame dungeon. Even the size and the scope of Hellfire Citadel can be a little bit smaller and a little bit more doable in one night, versus Tempest Keep has to have a lot of replay value there because that's where players are going to be for a long time.
Next up from the swamps of Azeroth, we have Murloc.
Thank you. Can you hold my son first, please? Thank you. First, I'd like to say, you said that we want to progress the game line, we want to keep it fun, we don't want to cross the line. Well, today is the day that we cross that line. You say you have power. Well, you do have power, and my people have been seeing your power. An expansion has come out today, and not only have you made my people a pet, but you have encouraged them to kill, and they shall be forgiven for their sins if they adopt one of my children. You're stealing my children. You're stealing them from their home of South Shore. We do nothing. We go, grr, 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 grr. That's not us yelling. That's not us screaming. That's us crying. We are crying.
No. I got you. Hang on. I got you on this one here. So first off, that was pretty good, but I'm known for the, hang on, here we go. So, first off, there's that. Second off, I am known. I am known perhaps as having written the most reviled and hated quest in all of World of Warcraft, and that is the Alliance version of Deep Ocean and Vast Sea.
Sean Carnes, ladies and gentlemen.
Every time one of you died on that quest, I grew in power and strength. I want you to know that.
You call that a quest. I call that genocide.
Somebody bring me his feet. I think I've got a magic bag in it for you.
There are Murlocks in Quel'Thalas that Blood Elf newbies get to kill. Big, I'm serious. Big exclusive.
This is my son you're killing!
And we're giving them out free, too.